Do 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 do. Hey, how's it going? It's Nancy Gamon. Have you ever wondered what you might look like after an autopsy? Well, today I'll help you find out. In this video, I'll show you how to turn an ordinary plain t-shirt into an autopsied one. To make this project, you'll need a solid color t-shirt. Black works well, or something that matches your skin tone, like gray or green. You'll also need 1/8 of a yard of red knit and about the same amount of double-sided fusible interfacing, a few straight pins, a sewing needle. You can use a straight needle, but a curved one yields a more authentic experience. Some cream-colored embroidery floss and scissors. You'll also need an iron and ironing board and just a few safety pins. Start with the t-shirt on and have your straight pins handy. The autopsy incision goes in a Y shape from your shoulders to your sternum to your pubic bone. So we're going to pin those key points. Start by feeling in your shoulder divot and putting a little pin there, and then in the other one, put a pin there. Feel for the center of your sternum and pin there. And then lastly, the top of the pubic bone and pin there. Just be careful not to poke yourself. Then take the shirt off. Actually, let me get back to you on that. Now we're ready to prepare the red knit to create the illusion of blood in the incision. You'll need your iron and ironing board, the red knit, the double-sided interfacing, and your scissors. Just lay the knit out onto the ironing board flat, and then place the double-sided fusible interfacing onto the fabric so that the fusible side, the textured side, is down against the fabric and the paper side is up. You want to leave some red fabric all around the edges so that the fusible doesn't get onto your ironing board. The iron is on cotton, and when it's hot, then fuse the interfacing onto the knit by moving the iron back and forth a few times to get that fusible melted and secured onto the fabric. You can check around the edge of the interfacing with your fingernail to make sure that everything is secure. I'm just going to make one more little pass here, and then I'm going to trim off the extra fabric at the end. And I'm going to cut this piece into 3 strips that are of equal width. Zippity-doo-dah-day. And that takes care of that step. We're ready to iron it on. I have the t-shirt laying on the ironing board inside out. You can just see the little bits of the straight pins peeking through from the other side. I'm going to take the red knit and peel the paper backing off of the strip, if I can get it here. And then I'm going to center it on the t-shirt so that it's about 1/2 inch longer at the bottom than where the pin is, and 1/2 inch higher at the neckline. And I'm just going to trim off the extra bit here at the top. I've got the shiny side down, the fusible side down towards the t-shirt, and I'm going to use my hot iron here to fuse the strip onto the t-shirt. It's okay to leave the straight pins in during this process. They will pull out after the ironing's done. And then I'm going to take another strip and repeat the process. Peel the backing off, center it in between the pins so that it's about 1/2 inch longer at the shoulder pin, and then trim it to fit around the center strip that I have fused down, and press that into place. And then I'll just do that one more time for the other shoulder area, peeling off the backing, centering it on the pins, making sure it's 1/2 inch longer at the shoulder, and then trimming it to fit around the centerpiece. Now we're ready to make the incision. Turn the shirt right side out and lay it flat on the ironing board. You should be able to see the straight pins in the front, and we're going to start by cutting in between the two pins that are along the center line. I'm going to get my safety gear on here so that I'm ready for the operation. Scalpel. And maybe better make that scissors. Much better. I have the t-shirt laid out flat on the ironing board. You can see the straight pins that we placed earlier, and we're going to cut in between the pins now to create the incision. So I'm just lifting up the top layer, and I'm going to take a little pinch here at the bottom of the shirt and make a snip with the scissors just to get the incision started. And then I'm going to snip down to the straight pin and take that out, and then cut up to the straight pin that's at the sternum and remove that. Then snip up to the pin at the shoulder seam and remove that, and snip up to the pin at the other shoulder seam and remove that. When we stitch up the incision, the red fabric will peek through. Now I'm going to take the shirt and slip it onto the ironing board so that we're ready to start sewing. Now I'm ready to stitch up the incision. I have the t-shirt right side out on an ironing board, and I have it safety pinned to the ironing board in several places so that the fabric stays nice and taut while I'm pulling the stitches. I cut about 4 feet of embroidery floss. The floss comes in strands of 6, and I separated that in half, so I'm just using 3 strands through my needle and no knot at the end. It's loose. So to start with, I'm going to secure these 3 flaps up here, and to do that I'm going to start with the top middle one coming up underneath about 1/4 of an inch from the tip of that point there. And having my thread loose, I'm going to make a little knot here to secure the thread, pulling right up against the edge of the fabric. And I'll trim that to maybe 1/4 of an inch. And then I'm going to come up underneath each of the side flaps, again about 1/4 of an inch from the pointy tip. So there's one, and I'll get the other one here. And then I'm going to come up again through that center V, not through the same hole, but just a little bit off of it, maybe 1/8 of an inch. And so that's going to be my securing knot to get those 3 flaps together. Now I'm going to sew down the length of this using a stitch called a baseball stitch, and I'm going to alternate side to side, coming up underneath. Whoops, there we go. So first one side and then the other, keeping my stitches maybe about 1/2 of an inch apart, and making sure that this loose end of embroidery floss stays loose and doesn't get doubled up under there. going to sew right down to the end here, and then when I've got down as close as I can go on either side, I'll take one last stitch here kind of at the tippy point. And then I'm going to pull out one of these 3 strands of thread. So I'm going to leave 2 in the needle and pull 1 out. And then take a second stitch there, coming up close to where the first one was. And then I'm just going to tie a knot in the embroidery floss. Maybe doing 3 times here so that it's nice and secure, and trim that about 1/4 inch. So that takes care of the long seam, and now I'm going to sew the 2 side V's. I'm going to unpin this, reposition the shirt on the ironing board, pin it again, and then sew. So I have the t-shirt shifted on the ironing board, and I've repinned it in several places, and now I'm getting ready to stitch from the shoulder to the sternum. I rethreaded my needle with a fresh length of thread, so I have plenty. Since this is a shorter distance, I just used 3 feet instead of 4. But I'm going to start in a similar way to what I did on the long seam. I'm just coming up underneath here at the shoulder point, and I'm going to tie a knot again in my loose thread, pulling it just tight enough to have it snuggled up close to the fabric, and I'll trim that to about 1/4 inch. And then I'm going to stitch in a similar way as I did down the front seam, just coming up underneath one side and then up underneath the next, moving back and forth with the stitches just about 1/2 inch apart, and pulling them tight as I go. When I get down to the point here, I'm going to tighten my seams, make sure everything's nice and puckery, and then I'm going to sneak underneath here and just do one more stitch up in the direction of this other side to make sure that the center gap is nice and secure. Then I'm going to do that trick again where I pull out one thread and leave the other 2 in the needle. And I'll just dip underneath the fabric here and take another stitch real close to where my last one came through. And then I'll tie a knot in the thread a couple of times to secure, and get that trimmed about 1/4 inch. So that takes care of that shoulder to sternum seam. Now I'm going to shift the t-shirt again and pin it again so that it's in a good direction to sew this last seam. I've shifted the shirt on the ironing board again and repinned it in several places, and now I'm ready to sew the last seam from the shoulder to the sternum. Again, I have some fresh thread in my needle, and I'm just starting at the shoulder tip here. I'll tie a knot in my thread. Trim it. And start sewing down this length in the same way. Made a mistake. I'm going to have to come back underneath one more time to secure that. There we go. Now I can tie my knot. I'm going to trim this a little bit. And there we go. One freshly autopsied shirt, and it hardly hurt at all, did it? Well, there you have it, your own Autopsy t-shirt. Wear it for Halloween, to the doctor's office, or anytime you'd like to alarm your mother. If you like the idea of an Autopsy t-shirt, but you don't have time to make one yourself right now, head on over to nancygamon.com to check on the current availability. Do 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 do